Did you ever wonder what became of Frederick Douglass's children? We all know Douglas, the self-liberated slave who became one of America's greatest abolitionist voices. An orator who shook the very foundations of slavery, and a statesman celebrated across the world. But after the Civil War, when America stumbled awkwardly into freedom and then quickly into segregation, what about his family? What about the 5 children who had to live not as symbols, but as flesh and blood people in a society still deeply scarred by racism? Here lies a striking paradox. Frederick Douglass himself was hailed as a towering figure, admired even by presidents and queens. Yet his sons and daughter often had to fight for survival, in the shadows of a nation unwilling to grant black families the equality their father preached. If Douglass was a blazing lighthouse guiding a generation toward freedom, then his children were small boats, forced to navigate the turbulent seas of post-Civil War America, tossed by waves of discrimination expectations and the heavy burden of carrying their father's name. Some answered with courage. One son took up arms in the Civil War, proving his bravery on the battlefield. Another carved out a haven by the sea, building a beach resort where black families could gather with dignity during the Jim Crow era. Their stories are layered with triumph, heartbreak, and quiet resilience. This is not just the tale of an American hero. It's the untold legacy of his children who struggled, endured, and in their own ways left behind ripples that history too often forgets. Number 5. Rosetta Douglas. Born in 1839, was Frederick and Anna's first child. From the start, Rosetta's life was intertwined with her father's crusade for equality. She was literally born into freedom in New Bedford, Massachusetts, arriving just a year after Douglas escaped slavery and married Anna. Rosetta grew up as a bright, curious girl who loved reading. At age 6, she stayed with family friends Abigail and Lydia Mott in New York, who taught her to read, write, and even sew. This early education gave Rosetta a foundation that many black girls of her time were denied. However, Rosetta faced racial barriers in schooling. In 1848, her father enrolled her in a private seminary in Rochester. Rosetta was forced to sit apart from the white students, isolated just because of her race. Frederick Douglass was outraged and used his newspaper to condemn this segregation. Despite these challenges, Rosetta persevered. She later attended Oberlin College's preparatory program and a teacher school in Massachusetts. She refused to let discrimination snuff out her thirst for knowledge. In 1863, during the Civil War, Rosetta married Nathan Spragg, a freedman who had little formal education. Life with Nathan proved difficult. He struggled to hold a steady job and even spent time in prison for a minor crime, leaving Rosetta to raise their children largely on her own. And there were many children. Rosetta gave birth to 7 kids, though tragically some did not survive childhood. As a mother, Rosetta worked tirelessly to support her family. Rosetta never sought the spotlight, but she quietly became a community leader and activist. She taught school for a time, and she was a critical thinker like her father, though hemmed in by the gender roles of the 19th century. In 1896, Rosetta helped found the National Association of Colored Women, joining other black women leaders to advocate for education and social reform. She also took up her pen to honor her heritage. In 1900, Rosetta wrote a loving memoir of her mother titled My Mother, as I Recall Her Preserving Anna Douglas's Story. In another essay, Rosetta boldly challenged America to give black women a chance to uplift their race, calling out the centuries of oppression that had held them back. Through her writings and organization work, Rosetta found her voice as a champion for black women's education and equality. However, Rosetta's relationship with her famous father went through challenges too. After her mother Anna died in 1882, Rosetta was deeply upset when Frederick Douglass remarried a white woman, Helen Pitts, in 1884. She could not support this interracial marriage, perhaps feeling it betrayed her mother's memory. This rift showed that even in the Douglass family, issues of race and loyalty were complicated. Yet Rosetta still loved her father and continued to uphold his legacy in her own way. Rosetta Douglass lived to age 67, passing away in 1906 in Washington, D.C. At the end of her life, she was active in her church and community. Though history often overlooked her, Rosetta's life was one of quiet resilience and purpose. She raised the next generation of Douglasses and fought for equality not with fiery speeches, but with steady, determined action. Number 4. Lewis Henry Douglas, born in 1840, was the fiery warrior of the family. Lewis was Frederick Douglass's oldest son, and he had his father's bold spirit in spades. As a teenager in Rochester, Lewis learned the printing trade working for his dad's newspapers, the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. But the defining chapter of Lewis's life began when the Civil War broke out. The war gave him a chance to directly fight for the freedom his father had been championing. In early 1863, after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army finally allowed black men to enlist. Lewis Henry Douglas, at 22, was one of the very first to sign up. On March 25, 1863, he joined the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first official African-American unit in the North. This was the regiment portrayed in the film Glory Volunteers, who knew they might pay the ultimate price for a country that had enslaved their people. Lewis quickly rose to the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest rank open to black soldiers at the time. He was brave, determined, and eager to prove that black men would fight with honor. Lewis saw intense combat. In July 1863, he and the 54th Massachusetts led the charge on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. A brutal battle where about half the regiment was killed or wounded. Amidst a perfect hail of shot and shell, Lewis miraculously survived unharmed. In the aftermath, he wrote a heartfelt letter to his sweetheart, Helen Amelia, who would later become his wife. Describing the carnage and courage of his comrades, Lewis vowed, "Should I fall in the next fight, I hope to fall with my face to the foe." That vivid line captures Lewis's fearless character. He was ready to die facing the enemy, not running away. Thankfully, he survived Fort Wagner, and his accounts of the battle helped awaken the North to black soldiers' heroism. Lewis continued to serve until 1864, when illness and a battle wound forced him to be discharged. He returned home a war hero who had literally shed blood for freedom. But the fight wasn't over. Reconstruction was just beginning. And Lewis jumped into the struggle for equality on the home front. Like his father, he believed justice had to be won in politics and society, as well as on the battlefield. After the war, Lewis worked as a teacher with the Freedmen's Bureau, educating newly freed slaves. He also learned typesetting, and with his father and brother founded a new newspaper in Washington, D.C., called the New National Era. As senior editor of this paper, Lewis used his pen to advocate for black advancement and to speak out on issues of the day. In the 1870s, he even served in local government. President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Lewis to the Legislative Council governing the District of Columbia. There, Lewis pushed for laws to stop discrimination, like a rule forcing restaurants to post fixed prices so they couldn't overcharge black customers. He was truly his father's son, fighting racism in all arenas. Yet Lewis also encountered bitter racism personally. He had become the first black typesetter at the government printing office. But white co-workers' intimidation drove him out. The printers' union refused to accept a black member, ending his job despite his skill. Frustrations like these only fueled Lewis's activism. He boldly criticized the federal government when it fell short on protecting black citizens. For instance, in 1899, he condemned President McKinley's administration for caring about colonizing the Philippines while ignoring racist violence at home. Lewis never hesitated to speak truth to power, even if it meant pointing out hypocrisy in high places. In his personal life, Lewis married Helen Amelia Logoon in 1869, the same woman who had awaited his return from war. Helen's father was a prominent black abolitionist as well. So they were a true freedom-fighting family. It appears they did not have children of their own, or none that survived, but they were deeply involved in helping raise and educate their extended family and community. By the turn of the century, Lewis's health declined. He suffered a stroke in 1904 that left him frail. Even then, one imagines the aging soldier still standing proud, perhaps reminiscing about that fateful charge at Fort Wagner. In September 1908, Lewis Henry Douglas passed away at age 67 in Washington, D.C. At his funeral, he was lauded as a man who had been a valuable citizen to his city and his country. Number 3. Frederick Douglas Jr., born in 1842, carried not only his father's famous name, but also a heavy burden of expectation, known as Fred Jr. to family. He was the third of the Douglas children and grew up in the thick of his parents' activism in Rochester. As a young man, Frederick Jr. was described as studious and passionate about the cause. He literally worked on the Underground Railroad as a teenager, helping his parents shelter escaping slaves in their home. It's fair to say activism was in his blood. When the Civil War came, Frederick Jr., like his brothers, wanted to serve the Union cause. He didn't become a soldier in the field, but he played a vital role as a recruiter of black troops to seek government work to support himself. Fortunately, having a famous father had one-perk connections. When Frederick Douglass Sr. was appointed U.S. Marshal of D.C. in 1877, he brought Fred Jr. into the office as a clerk. Later, when Douglas Sr. became Recorder of Deeds for D.C., Fred Jr. also secured a clerk position in that office. But even these positions were not handed on a silver platter. There's a telling incident in 1869 where Frederick Jr. wrote a letter applying for clerkship, noting that as a black tradesman, he was shut out of private industry and asking for a chance to serve his country. The head of the office himself, a Jewish immigrant, responded favorably and hired him, expressing solidarity as someone from a race equally maligned. This rare record shows Fred Jr.'s determination to fight for dignity through honest work, even when doors were slammed in his face. On the home front, Frederick Douglass Jr.'s life was marked by both joy and sorrow. He married Virginia Hewlett in 1869 in a wedding said to be attended by the elite of black Boston society. Together, they would have 7 children. Frederick Douglass had 7 grandchildren through this line. It sounds like a happy, bustling family, but heartbreak struck again and again. 5 of Fred Jr.'s 7 children died before adulthood. Several died in infancy. Only 2 sons lived past childhood, and even they died young in their 20s. One son, named Robert Smalls Douglas, after the famous black Civil War hero Robert Smalls, made it to 24 before passing in 1910. We can only imagine the pain Fred Jr. and Virginia endured as they buried child after child. It was a harsh reminder that fame and talent offer no immunity from life's tragedies. Through it all, Fred Jr. kept going, perhaps finding solace in work and in carrying on his father's mission. In 1892, Frederick Douglass Jr. died at the age of 50. He passed just 3 years before his illustrious father, meaning Frederick Sr. had to bear the grief of losing a child, something no parent should endure. Fred Jr.'s wife, Virginia, had died a few years earlier in 1889. So by the end, much of his immediate family was gone. He was initially buried next to Virginia in a D.C. cemetery, and later their remains were moved to the historic Woodlawn Cemetery in Washington. Number 2, Charles Raymond Douglas. Born in 1844 and would live long enough to see the 20th century. Charles was the baby boy of the family, named after Charles Raymond, a black abolitionist friend of Douglas, and in many ways the most entrepreneurial of the siblings. If Lewis was the soldier and Fred Jr. the organizer, Charles became the builder and visionary, translating the family's ideals into lasting institutions. As a youngster in Rochester, Charles delivered his father's newspaper around town and absorbed lessons in activism, just like his brother. When the Civil War came, teenage Charles was determined not to be left out. At 18, he tried to follow Lewis into the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in 1863. He was actually the first black man in New York to enlist for the Union, eager to fight for his people's freedom. Fate had other plans. Charles fell seriously ill during training camp and was never sent into combat. It must have been crushing for him to watch the 54th march off without him. Still, he didn't give up on serving. Charles later joined the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, another black regiment, and attained the rank of first sergeant. But again, ill health intervened. On his father's urgent request, President Lincoln discharged Charles in 1864 due to his condition. Though he never saw battle, Charles Douglas wore the Union uniform with pride, contributing however he could to the war effort. After the war, Charles turned to public service and business. He became one of the first African-American clerks in the Freedmen's Bureau, moving to Washington, D.C. with his family in 1867 to help newly freed slaves transition to freedom. He also worked in the U.S. Treasury Department for several years. Over a remarkable 53-year career in government, Charles held various posts from a Santo Domingo Commission clerk to a pension bureau examiner, breaking racial barriers and federal employment long before such opportunities were common. He even served as a trusted secretary and treasurer of D.C.'s integrated public school system, where he used his position as a school board trustee to hire black teachers and guarantee they received equal pay to white teachers. This was groundbreaking at a time when discrimination was the norm. Thanks to Charles's efforts, Washington's black educators got a fair chance to excel. It's clear that Charles believed in attacking inequality through institution building, creating spaces where black Americans could thrive. One of Charles Raymond Douglas's greatest achievements was born from both pain and hope. Family lore says that in the 1890s, Frederick Douglass I's second wife, Helen, were barred from a segregated beach resort on the Chesapeake Bay. In response, Charles decided to build a resort where black people would always be welcome. In 1892, Charles purchased 26 acres of beachfront property on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. On this land, he developed a community that became known as Highland Beach. Think of Highland Beach as an early example of black excellence by the sea, a summer retreat for black families to enjoy recreation without discrimination. Charles laid out plots, built cottages, and even constructed a beautiful home for his father there. In fact, Frederick Douglass Sr. was planning to spend that summer of 1895 at Highland Beach, but he passed away in February of that year, before he could do so. Still, Highland Beach thrived, becoming a prestigious African-American resort town. It attracted notable guests like Booker T. Washington. Over the years, Charles's vision had created a safe haven that defied Jim Crow-era norms, and to this day, Highland Beach remains a historic, incorporated black community. A living legacy of the Douglas family's determination to claim their piece of the American dream. In his personal life, Charles had his share of joys and sorrows. He married Mary Elizabeth Libby Murphy in 1866. They had 6 children, but much like his brother Fred Jr.'s experience, most of Charles's kids died young. Only one son, Joseph Henry Douglas, survived to adulthood. Joseph would become a renowned concert violinist, said to be the first black violinist to tour internationally, earning fame in the 1890s as the most talented violinist of his race. Imagine how proud Charles must have been to see his son Joseph carrying the Douglas legacy into the arts, inspiring audiences with music, just as his grandfather had, with words. Charles's wife Libby died in 1879, and later he remarried Laura Haley in 1880. With Laura, he had one more son, Haley George Douglas. Haley would later become the mayor of Highland Beach, keeping his father's dream community alive and well into the mid-10th century. The Douglas lineage thus continued through Charles's branch, merging public service with community leadership across generations. By the 1910s, Charles Raymond Douglas was one of the last men standing from the original Douglas family. He had outlived his father and all his siblings. In 1920, at age 76, Charles fell ill with kidney disease, Britt's disease, and passed away in Washington, D.C. He received a respectful burial at Columbian Harmony Cemetery, a historic black cemetery in D.C. Charles was survived by his second wife, Laura, and his 2 adult sons, Joseph and Haley. Newspapers eulogized him as the only surviving son of Frederick Douglass and a respected figure in his own right. Number 1. Annie Douglas was born in 1849, a late and beloved addition to the family. They called her Annie, and by all accounts, she was the darling of the household. Frederick Douglass doted on her. One visitor recalled seeing him gently holding little Annie in his lap as he worked on his newspaper, a tender image of the fierce abolitionist as a loving father. Annie grew up in Rochester with her siblings, likely shielded as much as possible from the hardships outside. But even her life was touched by the cause. It's said that as a child, she helped her mother provide food and comfort to the escaping slaves who hid in their home. She was a sweet, intelligent girl who brought joy to her weary parents. Tragically, Annie's life was cut painfully short. In March 1860, when Annie was only 10 years old, she fell gravely ill. We don't know exactly what sickness struck her, possibly something like brain fever menitis or another ailment that in those days had no cure. Despite all efforts, Annie Douglas died on March 13, 1860. Her death was a devastating blow to the family. Frederick Douglass was away in England on a speaking tour at the time, having fled there temporarily after the John Brown raid fallout. On hearing of Annie's condition, he rushed home, but heartbreakingly, she was gone by the time he arrived. Douglas was shattered. This loss curtailed his European tour and brought him back to the U.S. immediately, as one account noted. For Anna Murray, Douglas, Annie's mother, the loss was equally crushing. It said Anna's health declined after her youngest child's death. They buried little Annie at Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, where later Anna and Frederick would also be laid to rest.